Imagine a time when the world stood on the very edge of total destruction. This was not a movie plot or a work of fiction. It was a real event called the Cuban Missile Crisis. It happened in October 1962. For 13 terrifying days, the United States and the Soviet Union, the world's two biggest superpowers, were locked in a tense standoff. The reason for this confrontation was simple, but incredibly dangerous. The Soviet Union was secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. Cuba is an island nation just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. These missiles were powerful enough to destroy major American cities in minutes. The crisis brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. The discovery of these missiles was a shocking moment for the United States. It all started with a high-altitude U-2 spy plane. On October 14, 1962, this plane flew over Cuba on a reconnaissance mission. It took detailed photographs of the ground below. When American intelligence experts analyzed these pictures, they found something alarming. The images clearly showed launch sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles being built. The evidence was undeniable. The Soviet Union, led by Premier Nikita Khrushchev, was placing offensive nuclear weapons right at America's doorstep. This was a direct and serious threat to national security. This discovery triggered a secret, high-stakes debate within the White House. President John F. Kennedy was presented with the grim evidence on the morning of October 16th. He immediately assembled a group of his most trusted advisors. This group became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. They met in secret for several days, weighing the terrifying options before them. Some military leaders argued for an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. They saw this as the only way to eliminate the threat completely. However, President Kennedy knew that a direct military attack could be a disastrous move. He understood that attacking Cuba would likely lead to a swift and devastating response from the Soviet Union. This could escalate into an all-out nuclear war, resulting in millions of deaths on both sides and potentially the end of civilization as we knew it. Kennedy and his advisors had to find another way. They needed a solution that was strong enough to force the Soviets to remove the missiles, but not so aggressive that it would trigger a war. The fate of the entire world rested on the decision they would make in the coming days. After days of intense and secret deliberations, President Kennedy chose a middle path. He decided against a surprise airstrike. Instead, he opted for a more measured and strategic response. On the evening of October 22, 1962, he addressed the American people and the world in a televised speech. He revealed the existence of the Soviet missiles in Cuba. He announced that the United States would implement a naval quarantine around the island. This was essentially a blockade, but the word quarantine sounded less like an act of war. The goal was to stop any more Soviet ships from delivering military equipment to Cuba. The announcement of the quarantine immediately raised the stakes. The world watched and waited to see how the Soviet Union would react. The US Navy deployed a ring of warships and aircraft around Cuba. Their orders were to stop and inspect any Soviet ships heading for the island. This created an incredibly tense situation on the high seas. A single mistake or miscalculation could have led to a firefight between American and Soviet forces. Such a conflict could have quickly spiraled out of control, leading directly to the nuclear exchange everyone feared. The quarantine line became the focal point of the global standoff. In response to the American quarantine, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev condemned the action as an act of aggression and piracy. He insisted that the missiles in Cuba were purely for defensive purposes. He refused to acknowledge the blockade and ordered Soviet ships to continue their journey toward Cuba. For a few nail-biting days, it seemed a direct confrontation was unavoidable. Soviet ships, some likely carrying more military supplies, were steaming directly toward the American naval quarantine line. The world was on high alert, with military forces on both sides raised to their highest state of readiness, just one step short of war. This period was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. It was a high-stakes game of chicken, with two nuclear-armed superpowers on a collision course. President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, knew the immense pressure they were under. They had to project strength to force Khrushchev to back down, but they also had to leave him a way out to avoid cornering him into a rash decision. The ships got closer and closer to the quarantine line. The question on everyone's mind was a simple but terrifying one. Would the Soviets challenge the blockade? And if so, what would happen next? The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a conflict between leaders, it was a period of profound fear for ordinary people around the globe. In the United States, the reality of the nuclear threat suddenly became very real and very personal. President Kennedy's speech brought the crisis out of the secret meeting rooms and into every American living room. People listened to his solemn words and understood the gravity of the situation. The idea that a nuclear missile could strike their city with only a few minutes' warning was no longer an abstract concept. It was a terrifying possibility that dominated daily life. This fear manifested in many ways across the country. Schools began to conduct duck and cover drills, where children practiced hiding under their desks in the event of a nuclear blast. Families rushed to grocery stores to stock up on canned goods, water, and other emergency supplies. Some people even began building makeshift fallout shelters in their backyards or basements, hoping to survive the aftermath of a nuclear attack. Churches held prayer vigils, and people gathered around their radios and televisions, desperate for any news that might suggest a peaceful resolution was in sight. It was a time of shared anxiety and uncertainty. The tension was felt just as strongly in the Soviet Union and across Europe. While information was more tightly controlled by the Soviet government, people were aware that a serious confrontation was underway. They too understood the devastating power of nuclear weapons. In Europe, citizens felt trapped in the middle, knowing that a war between the two superpowers would likely turn their continent into a nuclear battlefield. The fear was global. The world collectively held its breath, hoping that the leaders in Washington and Moscow would find a way to step back from the brink of catastrophe. This intense atmosphere of fear had a significant impact on the decision-making process. The leaders on both sides were acutely aware that their choices could lead to the deaths of millions of their own citizens. This immense pressure forced them to think beyond simple military victory. They had to consider the human cost of their actions. The shared terror of nuclear annihilation created a strange, unspoken common ground between the two adversaries. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev wanted to avoid a war that no one could truly win. This mutual fear became a crucial, if grim, motivating factor in the search for a peaceful outcome. As the crisis reached its peak, communication between the leaders became absolutely critical. However, direct and instant communication was not possible in 1962. Messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev had to be sent through slow, formal diplomatic channels or through back-channel communications involving journalists and spies. One message from Khrushchev arrived via a rambling, emotional letter, while another, more formal message followed. To speed things up, Robert Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin. These secret meetings were vital for clarifying positions and exploring potential solutions away from public pressure. The breakthrough came through a series of these back-channel negotiations. On October 28th, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief when Moscow radio announced that the Soviet Union had agreed to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba. Premier Khrushchev agreed to remove the weapons under United Nations supervision. In exchange, President Kennedy publicly promised that the United States would not invade Cuba. This was the deal that was announced to the world, and it successfully de-escalated the immediate crisis. The Soviet ships turned back, and the work of taking apart the missile bases began. However, there was a second, secret part of the agreement that was not revealed to the public for many years. In his private meetings with the Soviet ambassador, Robert Kennedy had conveyed another promise from the president. The United States agreed to remove its own Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. These American missiles were old and somewhat obsolete, but their placement near the Soviet border was a major source of tension for Khrushchev. By agreeing to remove them, Kennedy gave Khrushchev a way to save face and present the outcome as a compromise, rather than a total defeat for the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught the world some very important lessons. The most significant lesson was the terrifying reality of nuclear brinkmanship. Both leaders realized they had come dangerously close to a catastrophe and that they needed better ways to manage future crises. As a direct result, a hotline was established in 1963, a direct teletype link between the White House and the Kremlin to allow for instant communication during an emergency. The crisis also provided momentum for arms control negotiations, leading to the partial nuclear test ban treaty later that year. It was a stark reminder that in the nuclear age, communication and compromise are not signs of weakness, but essential tools for survival.